of this talk you'll hear some background noise. The apartment I am in is on Broadway. There's a lot of siren activity, fire engines, ambulances, police sirens. This is New York after all. You may even hear some incidental shooting. So what I want to do, first of all, is thank the ITDI team and the gallery team and Chuck and Jason and Stephen in particular for setting up what looks like it's going to be a fantastic series of talks. What a great idea the summer intensive is, and not least because it's completely free. It's an honor to be a part of this idea where we use the resources of the internet to reach out to teachers all over the world and to interact with you. And I would like to make this as interactive as possible. I'm keeping an eye on the chat stream as it comes through. And any questions that you place in the chat that I miss, Chuck and Stephen are going to be gathering them for a bit of time that we'll have available at the end for any questions and answers. So as I say, I want to keep it as interactive as possible. So with that in mind, I thought we'd start with a poll, a kind of survey. So I'm going to ask Stephen to put the poll up, and I just want you to answer the questions whether you agree, disagree, or don't know. You'll see there are 4 questions there. Take your time, read the questions along the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you'll choose one of the 3 options, agree, disagree, or I don't know. And once we've got some results in, we'll move on to 4 more statements, and then we'll broadcast the results. So I'll give you a few minutes or a minute or 2 to do that. It's not a scientific survey, but it's kind of interesting to see what you all think. And then we'll discuss the results. Okay, we're getting, I think we've got nearly 50 responses to each of those questions. So let me see, number 4, 30 plus 19, yeah, 49, that's great. So I think, Stephen, if we can move on to the next set of questions, there's 4 more, so do the same with these, take your time. Wow, this is really interesting. We're getting 52 responses, which means everybody's participating, which is fantastic. And I think, Stephen, I think we're there. So we can go now to the results, Stephen, if you could put up the, now you should be able to see the answer to the first statement or the response to that, which was a fairly unanimous agreement to the proposition that mistakes are an integral part of language learning. less agreement on the second, about what the influence of the learner's first language on errors, although a majority agreeing with that statement. On the third statement, there's general agreement about the notion that lack of correction will lead to bad habits, but there's not a universal, it's not a unanimous point of view. And on the fourth statement about how this affects students, correction can affect students' attitude, it's fairly divided here between agreeing with the statement that it makes students shy and those who disagree. If we look at the results from the second set of questions or statements, thank you, Stephen, we'll see that there's strong opinion generally that it's better to get students to correct themselves, and very strong agreement with the notion that teachers need to be selective. On the seventh statement that correction doesn't make much difference, there's general disagreement with that statement, but there's a few outliers who are perhaps more skeptical of the value of correction. And amazingly, there is 100% agreement with the notion that learners' mistakes can provide useful material for teaching. So that suggests to me that I'm preaching to the converted here. I think a lot of you seem to share the opinions which I am going to express as we go through the talk. So let's go back to the original slide, if you may, Stephen. Thank you. And we've got all those statements arranged in succession, and I just want to talk through them very quickly. But as I say, I think we tend to agree here that some of them, though, are more controversial than others. I think it goes without saying that mistakes are an inevitable part of language learning, and this is for both the first language and the second language. It's just simply not the case that children are born speaking their first language accurately and fluently. There's a long period of non-standard, if you like, or non-target language use. Typical child utterances in English, things like daddy goed to work, for example, being almost a predictable stage of children's first language acquisition. Interestingly, the research that was started to be done in the 1980s and 90s, or even earlier, into second language errors showed very similar progression through stages that reflected very much the stages that children go through in learning English as their first language. So there's a kind of progression from statements without any auxiliary verb, daddy working, as opposed to daddy is working. Same thing happens with second language learners. Leaving out the third person S, of course, and he works, you work. Famously, very, very common error, irrespective of learners' first language. We'll come to that when we discuss the second statement. But there's no way that either in the first language or the second language we can avoid a fairly long period of non-standard English, in the case of English, such that it's often called interlanguage being the kind of language in development, as it were, in transition. And some would argue that maybe interlanguage never really ends that stage. There is no end state, if you like, in language acquisition. Not even in the first language. We're always learning things after all. We're always learning new vocabulary, and we're always getting it wrong. the number of times here in the United States, for example, I get things wrong is a source of a great deal of amusement to my students. How I mispronounce or get the emphasis wrong on an expression like "thanks for the heads up." And I still don't know whether it's a heads up or the heads up, and I'm not even sure if I'm using the expression correctly. Just as I'm not sure I'm using the expression "let's take a rain check." I have no idea what it means in its original form in baseball, and less idea what it means metaphorically. So we're learning all the time, and we're making mistakes all the time, and it's the feedback on the mistakes that feeds into learning. That's why it's called feedback, and we'll come to discussing the value of feedback shortly. But let's look at the second statement. Most errors are the result of differences between the learner's first language and their second language. And it was interesting that the majority of you tended to think that this was the case. And it's certainly the case that those of us who have been teaching a particular language group, whether it's Spanish speakers or Arabic speakers or Japanese speakers or Chinese speakers, do recognize certain errors that come up again and again, and that our knowledge of their first language can sort of explain. Often these are errors in vocabulary, false friends, but they're all and errors in pronunciation, of course, but there are also errors of grammar. The student who says, for example, the Arabic-speaking student who says, "That is the book which I lent you it," or "that is the person who I saw him," the extra object, if you like, there in relative clauses, is borrowing directly from their first language, Arabic in this case. And certainly for a very long time, those kind of observations, they kind of reinforced the view that learning a language is learning a new set of habits, and that the habits of the first language can, as it were, interfere in the habits of the second language. But what was interesting, in that research that was done in the 1970s, 1980s, the first really kind of systematic research into error, the so-called error analysis studies, found sort of surprisingly that there are a lot of errors that didn't seem to be specific to one particular language. In other words, Chinese speakers, Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers, speakers of Thai, all were making the same mistakes when they learned English. They were leaving out the auxiliary in sentences like "he working," despite the fact that in their own language, for example, Spanish, you have a form which correlates with the English auxiliary. So, "Mi padre está trabajando," is working. So why is the learner leaving it out if they already have it in their first language? So it was hypothesized that a lot of the errors that learners make are in fact not interference errors from their first language. They are what we call developmental errors. They're the errors that naturally occur as the interlanguage develops, just as they naturally occur in children learning their first language. So there was a kind of pendulum shift, if you like, away from the view that all languages are caused by L1 interference, first language interference, to the view that most errors are actually developmental. They're caused by the attempt to simplify or overgeneralize from the limited language that the students have been exposed to. And I think as all pendulum changes, there's a kind of shift being back again, that we still believe that a lot of errors are developmental, but we are accepting that nevertheless there are a lot of errors that are language specific. That is to say that Portuguese speakers will make certain kinds of errors that speakers of Thai will not, or Chinese speakers will make errors that speakers of French will not. So we're kind of the pendulum is slowing down, as it were. So when you, in the response to the poll, although the majority of you suggested that you think that L1 errors or L1 influences second language errors. There's a lot of you thought that that wasn't entirely the case, and I think that split does represent current thinking in this area. So looking at statement number 3, if teachers don't correct learners' mistakes, they will become bad habits. And again, the choice of the term habit here, of course, in a sense dates this idea because it associates it with the view that language learning is simply habit formation, which goes back to the view that bad habits need to be replaced by good habits. Therefore, don't use the first language in the classroom because it will perpetuate the bad habits and the interference from the student's first language. So, I mean, there was a kind of, when all that research came in about developmental errors, there was the opinion that maybe, well, it's not a case of the learner's mistakes becoming bad habits. Maybe they, in the course of time, they will sort of disappear. They will come out in the wash, if you like. Give the learner enough exposure and enough practice, these errors will gradually kind of dissipate. But again, this pendulum's kind of swinging back and saying, well, the research is suggesting that unless there is some explicit focus on form, which includes giving feedback as to accuracy, then certain errors do become entrenched. And although we may not use the term habits anymore because it has these kind of negative associations with behaviorism, nevertheless, entrenchment, which is a kind of politically correct term now used for habituation, does seem to occur. I mean, some of the earliest studies on immersion language programs, for example, in Canada, showed that students whose first language was English, this is school students, learning their subjects in French, achieved very high levels of accuracy and fluency in French without any specific lessons in French. In other words, they're learning their math and their biology and their geography in French and speaking English at home. Nevertheless, the research, when it looked closely at these immersion studies, still found that there are a number of entrenched errors, if you like, or non-standard forms that didn't seem to come out in the wash, as it were, which led people to rethink the view that simply by communicating you can learn a second language, that there needs to be the so-called focus on form. That is to say, learners' attention needs to be directed to features of the forms that they are using, not just encouraged to express their meanings. And one way of focusing on form, and one very traditional way of focusing on form, is through error correction. So we've kind of come back to the view that, yeah, communicate, that's fantastic. But there needs to be strategic focus on form, and that could be via error correction. And we'll look at some techniques and some ways of doing that shortly. So I would say, I would agree with you all who said that focusing on students' mistakes, if you don't, they will become bad habits. In general, however, there is some research to support the view that focusing on errors in written work, because so far we've been sort of talking as if students only speak, but of course they write, and teachers give corrections on written work. The evidence, unhappily, suggests that students don't seem to notice error correction on written work to the extent that they improve, or few students do, or students only do if they are forced, for example, to rewrite their written work. But I think it is the case, and we've all experienced this, that you mark somebody's homework, you make comments about their errors, if they look at the grade, and then they throw the thing in the bin. So we really need to think, those of you who are teaching writing, particularly academic writing, where very high standards operate, we are challenged by the need to think, how can we make learners notice our corrections, and how can we make them incorporate our corrections into their rewriting. Number 4, then, the statement, correcting mistakes makes students shy. Again, you were fairly evenly divided on this question. The majority disagreed, but there are a lot of people who suggested that it can have a negative effect on students' attitudes if they're corrected. And I think we need to be aware of that, because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that students in classrooms are very often in a high state of anxiety, although they don't always show it. There's been studies, diary studies of learners, so they keep diaries, written diaries about their experiences in classrooms, and the researchers looking at these diaries are shocked how often their informants, the diary writers, report feelings of anxiety in the language classroom. Anxiety at being asked to speak, and anxiety about being corrected in front of their peers. So I don't think we can underestimate the fact that for certain learners at least, errors can create negativity. I remember the case of my niece, my English-speaking niece, who came to visit us in Spain when she was about 18, and I enrolled her in a Spanish class in Barcelona, and she attended about 3 classes, and then she stopped. And I said to her, "What happened? Why did you stop your Spanish classes?" And she said, "The teacher corrected me." And I think for her that was one humiliation too far. It was enough to be learning another language and saying things in another strange language. It was just too much to get correction. So I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that there are certain learners for whom correction can be face-threatening. On the other hand, my own experience recently of being enrolled in an intensive Spanish course as a kind of intermediate or high intermediate user of Spanish was that I went to the classes. I chose to go to classes deliberately because I wanted correction. I've been speaking Spanish badly for years with friends, in the street, in restaurants, with taxi drivers, etc., and nobody corrects me because either they don't hear the errors, or they don't think they're important, or they don't think it's their job. So for years, I've been speaking uncorrected Spanish. So I said, this is enough. I want to go back to the classroom because I want feedback. And I was very grateful that the teachers that taught me Spanish in those classes were very prepared to give it. And they were, there was no embarrassment in their correcting our errors. And I think as a class, as students, we were very grateful. But we're talking here about adult students, fairly motivated, and also at a relatively high level. So we can afford to make mistakes because we are actually relatively fluent. So again, I think we need to re-examine this one about the affective nature of correction and try not to take either side too literally. It would be, I think, dangerous never to correct mistakes because you're afraid of hurting the student's feelings. At the same time, it would be dangerous to correct every mistake because you are then in danger of inhibiting the students. And this comes to the question later on, number 6, the statement. But let's look at number 5 now. Rather than correcting students, it's better to get students to correct themselves. I think you're fairly unanimous about this, and I think certainly for all sorts of reasons, and maybe the affective, the emotional reason too, it's kind of better. It's less threatening if students given a chance to correct themselves first before the teacher corrects them or before their other students are allowed to correct them. So they can at least, they don't lose so much face. Of course, they may not be able to correct themselves, and then we have a problem. Not only did they make a mistake, but they couldn't correct it. So that's like double whammy. However, conventional thinking is that we should try to get students to correct themselves, and then we should do what we need to do as teachers to make that possible. And I'll come to some of these techniques in a minute. What messages can we give the learners so that they can correct themselves with a reasonable chance of success? Number 6, the teacher should be selective when correcting mistakes. I think this was the one that got a 98% vote in favor. I think, I don't think there's much disagreement about that. The question is then, but selective about what? What errors do we select to correct? I'll give you a chance now to throw in some suggestions into the chat box. Which errors should teachers correct and which ones should they ignore? So post your suggestions in this chat box and I'll see if I can capture some of them. Jason says, those that interfere with understanding. Sue says, errors that inhibit communication. Exactly, same thing. We should recurring mistakes, says Alexandra. So kind of persistent ones. Ones that severely, Shreya says, same thing, ones that impede communication. Correctable errors, says Ruth in Japan. Yes, those that are more easily dealt with. That's an interesting idea. Again, Bob says, those are likely to confuse. Accent errors do not have to be attacked, says Judy. And that's another interesting thing. We haven't mentioned pronunciation very much here. Mark says, errors occurring in structures that are a bit off, but not far off. Okay, so they're in the kind of zone of proximal development, if you like. Errors that impede understanding. Pronunciation errors. Muhammad in Turkey says you should protect pronunciation errors. That Judy said accent errors don't really matter. Oh, Adi from India says errors that lead to pragmatic failure. That's impressive. Meta-language there, Adi. Yeah, the ones that kind of lead to misunderstandings in communication that may even be cultural. Pronunciation errors that learners may be unaware of. Okay, so again, it may be a case of raising awareness through correction. And Lisa makes the point, it depends on the student's objectives. Of course it does. Some students are simply quite happy being fluent but inaccurate. So maybe this is something that we need to discuss with them. How much do you want to be corrected? Julie says errors which are embarrassing. Yeah, we don't want students saying things like, estaba muy embarazada. I was very embarrassed, meaning pregnant in Spanish, for example. So false friends need to be sorted out. Errors that relate to misunderstanding, culture-related errors. Yeah, we haven't really mentioned cultural errors, except Adi's mention of pragmatic errors. Intonation errors. Intonation, well, that's a very hard one, Juan. Very hard. Intonation is one of those really difficult areas to access at a conscious level. Nevertheless, okay, so fantastic. Word order, syntax errors. Yeah, more on pronunciation. Okay, well, I mean, I think you've covered it. I think global errors, errors that impede overall communication as opposed to discrete errors, small errors which don't really, and that might include accent errors, because accent errors, we all have accents. I have an accent. I wonder if you've spotted it. It's certainly not the same as Chuck's accent, and it's not the same as Jason's accent. It's not the same as Judy's accent. So accent doesn't impede understanding to a great deal across native speakers. Why should impede understanding in non-native speakers? Embarrassing errors, yeah. I mean, we need to preempt situations where students will say things which will make them seem ludicrous. But I think the point that, now I can't remember who made it, that it depends on the learner's objectives here. And it depends on the kind of people they'll be interacting with. And given that many learners of English may not, on the whole, be interacting with native speakers of English a great deal, even though they may aspire to, that is to say, they will be largely interacting with other users of English as a second or foreign language, then we need to kind of perhaps reposition the goalposts a little. Is it native-like accuracy that we should be aiming at, or is it global intelligibility? And if it is global intelligibility, without necessarily diminishing or ignoring the aspirations of our learners, I think we can be more selective about the kinds of errors that we focus on. Errors of intelligibility being those that are perhaps more important than errors of native-like accuracy. Now this is obviously a contentious issue. It's not going to go away, but I think it does give teachers a little bit of wiggle room here in terms of saying, well, I'm going to let that one go by because, frankly, I don't think it really matters. If this student who speaks Japanese as their first language is talking to a student who speaks Portuguese as their first language, will this really matter? We need more data, of course, on what errors do matter, and research has been done on pronunciation errors that don't matter. We need a bit more research on grammatical, lexical, pragmatic errors that don't matter. Okay, time's moving on. 7, correction doesn't make much difference to the learning process. Well, I've already indicated that, in fact, some kind of focus on form does seem to make a difference. And if correction is a kind of focus on form, then correction probably does make a difference. I mentioned the studies, the immersion studies in Canada, for example, which first alerted researchers to the fact that pure communication on its own may not necessarily achieve levels of accuracy that are acceptable. So I think the feeling now is, yeah, correction does make a difference, and negative feedback makes a difference, telling students when they're wrong rather than simply telling them when they're right. In other words, feedback, if it's only positive, that is to say, fantastic, you're great, you made a sentence in English, you said something, you used the present tense, wow, fantastic. That's nice, but it doesn't necessarily do the learner a great service if they don't also know what they did wrong. And then finally, I was very pleased to see that all of you unanimously agreed with statement number 8, that learners' mistakes can provide useful material for teaching. Indeed, in fact, possibly some of the most useful material for teaching. And material that students really welcome. I remember I had an advanced class of students in Spain, and one of the activities I did frequently was I would take sentences from their homework, anonymized, in other words, without the name of the student, lots of different sentences from lots of different students, and put them onto one sheet of A4 or beam them up onto the wall, beginning of each lesson. Here are some sentences from your homework, in pairs or in small groups, see if you can correct them. And they loved doing that, and they actually mentioned that in the feedback. And of course, one of the things we liked most was correcting the errors. And the one reason was it was anonymized. There was no threat to face because nobody knew who had made which error. And also because, given the fact that they were all speakers of Spanish as their first language, they did share quite a lot of the same problems. So it was kind of good to get them out. So that kind of activity can be great. But I also learned that I should include sentences which were correct. So not just give the message that it was all negative, but put in some sentences which were correct. So the first job is to sort the correct sentences from the incorrect, and then correct the incorrect ones. But give students credit for the correct sentences they produce in their homework just as much as using the ones that are not correct. So, just a little bit of background, some of the research that has been done into error. I'll just summarize a few points that I think are interesting. And the first one is that teachers are generally tougher on error than non-teachers. Shalki, your comment is, I'm going to address that in a second. So thank you for raising that about non-native and native speaker teachers. In fact, I'll raise it now. Non-native speaker teachers are generally tougher on error than native speaker teachers. Now, wonder why? Any ideas? Non-native speaker teachers are generally tougher on error than native speaker teachers. Maria in Greece says maybe because they're more aware of their own mistakes. Yes, I think so. It's like, Shanti says it's like ex-smokers are more intolerant. I think that's a brilliant analogy. I think it's so true. More sensitive about it, says Judy, is the persisting belief of being a non-native speaker. Yeah, that kind of maybe the slight, dare I say it, sense of, but I think it's also because teachers often feel, well, I made it, you know, I've got there, I learnt the language, I speak it accurately, so why can't you? Whereas perhaps native speaker teachers are more in awe of the fact that the students are saying anything at all. From Bulgaria, Slavka says that teachers are used to correcting mistakes, and they come from an educational tradition, perhaps, where the focus is very much on accuracy. Yeah. And I think, yes, Trinidad in Sri Lanka, I think you're absolutely right. Maybe non-native teachers get more error correction in their English education. Absolutely. So it's an educational thing, it's a cultural thing, and it's also the fact that they've experienced the process themselves, so they're perhaps more in tune with it. So that's the second observation from the research. A third observation is that teachers do not treat all the errors that occur. So we've sort of said already, discussed that. Why is that? Because they are selective. And finally, I thought this was interesting. Learners often say that they want more error correction than is usually offered. So teachers, while teachers are selective, students are frustrated. Now, it's not always true. Is that what you're suggesting, Slavka? But generally, the research suggests that they often feel shortchanged by the lack of correction. And this may be, again, because their teachers are native speakers who are being either more tolerant or less vigilant. But I think it's an interesting observation, and I wonder how often we ask our students how much correction that they want. Maybe something we should do more systematically. So let's look now at, again, a little bit more background theory here before we look at some examples. I think it's the case that if we don't allow students to make errors, they won't learn very much. So we need a culture, a classroom culture in which errors are accepted and even encouraged. This is a quote from an article in Scientific American, came out a few years ago, and it struck my attention because although it's not about language learning, it's about learning generally. But researchers found that learning becomes better if conditions are arranged so that students make errors. Make errors. Getting the answer wrong is a great way to learn. Now, this might seem obvious, but when I think back to my own training as a teacher, I was very much schooled in the view that we should avoid learners making errors at all costs. We should never set up situations in which learners might make errors. Therefore, we had them repeat things that the teacher said and never say anything until the teacher had said it first. And this was very much the kind of the tail end of the audio-lingual approach, where language learning was considered to be learning a set of habits. So I was trained so as to avoid the occurrence of errors in the classroom. which meant that it was incredibly controlled and incredibly boring and frustrating for everybody involved. And when I started taking a few risks with that and letting the students kind of express themselves, even at quite low levels, I was amazed, first of all, by their communicativeness, and secondly, by their resourcefulness, how they managed to communicate using limited means, even if it meant making mistakes as such. And that's when I started to realize that there is a long stage which learners go through where mistakes are inevitable. And not only that, that these mistakes can be fantastic material for classroom teaching, as you've already agreed is the case. More recently, a researcher in education, general education, called John Hattie, who's done a lot of studying of studies, basically. He's the man who analyzes other people's research studies and kind of crunches the statistics together. And he has concluded categorically that all this research into education generally means that we need classes that develop the courage to err, the courage to make errors, the courage to make mistakes. As Shalky says, risk-taking is the key to better learning. You've got to take risks. You can't learn anything if you are not prepared to step outside of your comfort zone. And then finally, in our own field, the research in second language acquisition, this is Rod Ellis in his massive book on the second language acquisition research, says that there is clear evidence that corrective feedback contributes to learning. So if there was any doubt that corrective feedback didn't help, the research would tend to dispel it. So the question then is not whether or not to correct. I think the question is how. And that's what I want to look at now. So in the time remaining, let's imagine a student during the course of a classroom discussion or activity says this. Are you ready? My brother is a good cooker. Yeah, you've heard that kind of thing. The question is, what does the teacher do? What are the options that the teacher has in terms of responding to that non-standard form? Instead of my brother is a good cook, my brother's a good cooker. So Muhammad has said, cooker? Question it, yeah? Fatin says, reread the sentence with the correct word. So the teacher says, my brother's a good cook. So explicit correction. Lisa says, really, he's a good cook. So she kind of like throws it back conversationally, but corrects the error. Or Anastasia leaves a gap. My brother is a good, in other words, to encourage self-correction, right, Anastasia? The Shanti says, oh, your brother is a good cook. So again, so replying it's conversationally, but recasting, rephrasing the expression in the correct way. Mark Jones calls it recasting, exactly. Some anonymous guest says, make a little joke. He's an oven. Yeah, you could say, is he a gas cooker or electric cooker? They will never make that mistake again. Okay. Okay, you got the idea. Well, here are some of the options, just to show you how many there are. We've covered a number of them already. The teacher could just say no. That's a clear indication that there's something wrong there. It doesn't say what is wrong, so it's not very informative. Or the teacher could say, no, my brother is a good cook. Okay, again, clear indication there's a mistake, and it says exactly the same sentence, the student's sentence, but correcting the target form. Is there any value in that, do you think? I mean, I think one of the values in that is that it's explicit. So often correction is not realized, or students don't realize when they hear a correction that it is a correction. We'll see some examples in a minute. So there's no doubt about number two. It doesn't allow the student any chance to self-correct, but it is a very clear message. Or the teacher could say wrong noun, or words to that effect, using some kind of terminology. This is what's often called a prompt. The idea is to prompt the learner into self-correcting and to indicate more or less where the error is. A lot of corrections, traditionally at least, take the form of these kinds of prompts. And I have no problem with this, assuming that the learners have got the requisite meta-language, that is the terminology, to understand the prompts. Or, this was the example I think came up with, a teacher questions it, so it indicates there's a problem, but doesn't say what the problem is, by using a rising intonation. My brother is a good cooker? Or, and this, I think, I can't remember who mentioned this, but this idea of leaving the gap. My brother is a good to elicit self-correction. Or, no, cooker is the equipment for a person to say cook. Now, this is a kind of little lesson point that's been made out of the error, where the teacher's using the error to kind of correct it, but at the same time explain why. This seems to be perfectly valid if it doesn't take too long. Now, this is different from number 5. Why? Because it's more conversational. Not my brother is a good, different from number 4. It's your brother is a good cooker. Like, I'm sorry, I kind of understand, but I don't. Could you just clarify? This is what's sometimes called a clarification request. And these clarification requests, when you kind of show that something's not quite right here, I don't quite understand you. So it's not offered so much as correction, something is wrong, but I don't understand you. There's an intelligibility problem. The research suggests that these can be very effective. That the second time round, students tend to get it right more often than they get it wrong. On the other hand, there are many students who don't recognize this as a correction. They just suddenly say, yes, 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 he's a good cooker. He's a very good cooker. He's the best cooker in our family. And so on and so on, because they don't recognize the intent of the question. Similarly, your brother is a good cook, is he? Now this is different. Notice that there's the cooker is turned into cook here. There's a reformulation or recasting, but it's still offered as a conversational turn. Student says, my brother is a good cook. Teacher says, your brother's a good cook, is he? On the hope that the student will notice the difference and somehow internalize it. Again, it's often the case that they don't notice these recastings. However, they are very popular with teachers. A more general way of showing misunderstanding is simply showing some kind of, using some kind of device to elicit a repeat or a correction. I'm sorry? What? Hang on, I don't understand. Even if you do understand, that can actually be very effective. You could ignore it completely. Oh, really, what kind of things does he cook? But that really isn't any kind of feedback. It's simply giving the learner credit for being a participant in the conversation and maintaining the conversation. Or, and a lot of teachers do this, they simply say, good. Good. He's a good cooker. Good. Which, of course, is not really of any use whatsoever. Nevertheless, in certain contexts, that may be the most appropriate. Remember my niece and her inhibitions about being corrected. But what I'm trying to show you here is the vast range of choices that are available, at least 11 here, and actually many more. And these are being researched extensively as we speak. And the research is still unresolved in terms of what is the best, the prompts or the recasts in particular. And there's those who argue for the recasts and those who argue with the prompts. The research does suggest, however, that in classrooms where the emphasis is on meaning, on communication, and that would be in immersion classrooms, in CLIL type classrooms with content and language integrated learning, where the learners are learning the subject through English. In other words, where the focus is primarily on meaning, then recasts, that is, corrections that focus on the meaning of what the person's saying, tend to be ignored because they're already focusing on meaning. And so it's not like, so when if you use 7 or 8 or 9 even, the students will tend to repeat the mistake. So what they need is probably something more explicit. They need 1, 2, 3. No, no, my brother's a good cook. Wrong noun. They need to switch the focus on meaning onto form. And they need an explicit signal, a traffic light, a red light, saying, no, think about the form. On the other hand, classes where the focus is largely on form, where they're learning structure and grammar and blah, 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 and accuracy, they're more likely to appreciate interventions of the type 7, 8, or 9. That is to say, meaningful, recasting kind of ones. So it depends a lot, the effectiveness depends a lot on the context. I'm just going to show you, this will blow your mind. People who have researched all the choices available have come up with diagrams like this. I mean, don't even look at it, you'll go cross-eyed. But it starts off with an error, and then these are all the different choices, a kind of decision tree, if you like, and it doesn't even end where you see there's arrows that carry on. So all the different possible choices. And these are the things that researchers love to research. Here's some examples in context. Teacher. After they have put up their tent, what did the boys do? Learner. They cooking food. Teacher. No, not they cooking food. Pay attention. Learner. They cooked their meal. Right, they cooked their meal over an open fire. So here we have a very explicit no, yeah, negative feedback, no doubt about it. Seemed to work. Here's another one. Learner. On Sunday, what did you do? Another learner says, oh, I stayed in home. Teacher says, at home. The learner says, on Sunday I stayed at home and watched the Wimbledon final. What did you do on Sunday? On morning, teacher, in the morning. Learner, in the morning I took a bus. So here we have very successful interventions. The teacher, while the two students are talking to each other, the teacher is intervening and providing explicit corrections. And they seem to work. Notice how the learners pick them up. There's 100% uptake, at least on those two errors. Here's another one. Now, this is an example of students who are giving a presentation in class. They've done a project, a biology project in English, the Spanish-speaking students, and the student's giving a presentation, and he says, I think that the worm will go under the soil. The teacher says, I think that the worm will go under the soil. Jose doesn't pick up on it. And then the teacher says, okay, she realizes that this needs explicit correction. I thought that the worm would go under the soil. And Jose repeats it. I thought the worm would go under the soil. This was in the context of a study to see how effective these kinds of interventions were in terms of learning the past tense. And the results of the study suggested that they were very effective. And one more, I hope you can read this. You might need to expand your screen there. But it's a teacher having a chat with a student talking about movies. And the teacher says, Vin, have you been to the movies? What's your favorite movie? And the student says, Big. And the teacher says, Big, okay, that's a good movie. That was about a little boy inside a big man, wasn't it? Yeah, boy gets surprised all the time. Yes, he was surprised, wasn't he? Usually little boys don't do things that men do they? No, little boy no drink. That's right, little boys don't drink. You see what's happening there? There's a clear case of no correction, but recasting, where the teacher, student says, little boy no drink. Teacher says, that's right, little boys don't drink. And this seems to be perfectly appropriate given the conversational nature of the discussion. The question is, to what extent do those recastings get noticed? And this is again where as I say, where the research is still undecided. I'm going to move on now because I'm conscious that it's getting on and it's getting late. But I'd just like to go, I'm going to click on a couple of slides here too. Now again, this is maybe difficult for you to read. You might want to expand your screen here. But it's an example of a teacher, again, talking to students in the context of a discussion about a real incident. And the teacher says to the student, "You were delivering mail to the patients?" Student says, "Yeah." Teacher says, "How many times did you go?" And the student says, "No. I should go, but I didn't go." And the teacher says, "I was supposed to go." That's a good one. "I was supposed to go." And she taps the table. Everyone, "I was supposed to go." All the students repeat it. Again, "I was supposed to go, but I couldn't, but I couldn't." Or all the students, "But I couldn't." Again, "But I couldn't." "I was supposed to go, but I couldn't." Again, "I was supposed to go, but I couldn't." "I was supposed to go, but I didn't." You can say, "But I didn't." Aha. Because the baby's sick? The baby is very sick. What's the matter? Now notice what's happening here. The student is telling a story. The teacher is engaged with the student in a kind of conversation. But when the teacher sees an opportunity to make a correction or to teach something new, she kind of stops the conversation. She teaches the form here, "I was supposed to." She practices it with the class, and then she goes back to the conversation. Is the baby still very sick? What's the matter? I don't know, and so on. So what you've got a very interesting combination here of sort of conversation integrated into correction and language teaching. And it's that kind of wonderful sandwiching of the two that seems to be the most successful kind of teaching, where on the one hand there's conversation, but on the other hand there are opportunities for learning. And the teacher is kind of orchestrating these two different currents, if you like, at the same time. Aziz says, "Is that teach and test?" I think it's teaching and testing at the same time, or it's teaching and talking at the same time. It's what some people call instructional conversation. Instructional conversation. Matthew, you got it. You beat me to it. And this is a definition of instructional conversation. It says the task of schooling, of education that is, can be seen as one of creating and supporting instructional conversations. The concept itself contains a paradox. Instruction and conversation appear contrary, the one implying authority and planning, that is instruction, the other equality and responsiveness. The task of teaching is to resolve this paradox, the paradox between instruction on the one hand and conversation on the other. To most truly teach, one must converse. To truly converse is to teach. And I want to leave you with that thought, because to me this seems to be the answer to all the problems we have about how to deal with correction. That correction is embedded into the conversations we have with our learners and is a kind of current that runs alongside it, then maybe it will be the most effective kind of correction. So there's a focus on meaning, hand in hand with a focus on form. And so it's exactly where I am, 11 o'clock. So I've talked for a full hour. I'm going to end now, but I will invite Chuck and Jason, if they want to throw in any questions they may have gathered, or any of you who have questions that you want to key in now. I will take 10 minutes of questions before I bid you good morning, good afternoon, or good night. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Anastasia. Coffee time indeed, Judy. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Alexandra. Tatiana. Thank you, Amelie. Thank you, Ruthie. I'm so glad it wasn't disappointing. Well, we seem to be getting a lot of thanks here, so maybe the questions in a sense are redundant, but I'll hang around, and for those of you who are leaving, thank you for your attention. Matthew, clearly, hang on, it's going too quickly. Teaching from the sidelines, yes, exactly. And I think teaching from the sidelines it needs to be integrated into teacher training. You're absolutely right. And in fact, the hardest thing in teacher training at pre-service level is training teachers to deal with error. They really are all at sea. They either overcorrect, undercorrect, correct at the wrong time, never correct the wrong things. It's a late acquired skill. I don't know how you get people there quickly. Maybe watching videos of people doing it. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Vera. Thank you, Shauki. Shauki, what about the errors related to cultural issues? Well, cultural issues are often more sensitive than language issues. So, again, you're better positioned, I think, if you are of the same culture as well as the same language as your learners to engage in those things. I think we need to be very cautious if we're coming from an outside culture to kind of rule about what is cultural, what is acceptable, etc. It's like sort of teaching good manners, and I'm always a bit nervous about teachers who think that part of English teaching is teaching good manners. Thank you, Rose. Lovely to see you here. I knew you were here all the time, Rose, but lovely to see you in the discussion. Further links and related studies to instructional conversation. Stephen's relaying a question from Shreya. Yeah, if you look at my website, perhaps my blog, any of the, I'm trying to think offhand which particular entries deal with instructional conversation, but in a sense it's an undercurrent for a lot of them. If you look at anything on Dogma, Teaching Unplugged, you'll find references to instructional conversation. Thank you, Rose. Lovely to see you here, as I say. How do you see the concept of IC develop in the future? You mean remind me, are we talking about here of internet communication? Bob is a little uncomfortable about instructional conversation. Will be not to interrupt. Yeah, no, this is the traditional wisdom, Bob. Don't interrupt. But I'm really interested in teachers who manage to do this and then get back to the conversation. And I think it is possible. And I think you can intervene without interfering. But it's a very fine balance. But I think it's also those interventions tend to be very salient in terms of learning. They're the things we kind of pick up on. Instructional conversation. I'm sorry. Do you see the concept developing in the future? Yes, I hope so. I hope so. I hope that's the way. That's certainly the way that in my own teacher training I try to push teachers. As Judy acknowledges. Juan, yes, I agree. There's a fine balance, intervening without interfering. And it's something that it's difficult to train people to do. It's something people acquire. Maybe watching, as I said before to Matthew, maybe watching videos of people doing this successfully. But reading transcripts like that one I just showed you about supposed to can be perhaps helpful. Matthew, Scott, what's really on my mind now is that are you going to do another advanced course at ITDI, perhaps a training on the housing instructional concept? Well, maybe. I'm just waiting to be asked, Matthew. You know, I don't do much. I just sit around waiting to be asked. Okay. Oh, Chuck. Yeah, well. No, here we go. Bob. Oh, hi, Bob. Yeah, well, if you pay me in green tea, Bob. Talking of green tea, I think it's time I finish my breakfast. So let's leave it at that. It's been great interaction with Chris. I'll hand back to Chuck now.
Thank you, Scott. That was just absolutely fabulous. I was sitting here taking notes and trying to tweet, and wow, multitasking is not my best skill. Just a fabulous session. I think everybody agrees. We're so grateful to you for missing part of your breakfast to come here and talk to us. It was really, really good. Very interactive session. So, Scott, what's up for the rest of your summer?